The autumn wind whistled through the narrow streets of Cheltenham, carrying fallen leaves in its wake, as Richard Blackwood stepped out of the back entrance of his restaurant, the Golden Fork. At 54, he cut an impressive figure. Tall, distinguished, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that carried a perpetual hint of melancholy. The restaurant's bins needed emptying, a task he insisted on doing himself every evening, much to his staff's bewilderment. But for Richard, these quiet moments provided a rare respite from the constant bustle of running his successful chain of restaurants. The streetlights cast long shadows across the cobblestones as he made his way to the large industrial bins. His restaurant, housed in a beautiful Victorian building, stood as the flagship of his empire. 15 establishments spread across the Cotswolds, each one a testament to his passion for fine dining and his late wife Catherine's dream. As he approached the bins, a movement caught his eye. In the dim light, he noticed a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, hurriedly stepping back into the shadows. She wore layers of mismatched clothing, her dark hair partially hidden under a worn beanie. What struck him most was not her apparent homelessness, but the graceful way she moved. Something about it seemed hauntingly familiar. "It's all right," Richard called out softly, setting down the bags. "Are you hungry? We have perfectly good food that we can't sell tomorrow." It was something he'd started doing years ago. Catherine's influence again. She'd always believed in helping others whenever possible. The young woman hesitated, then stepped forward slightly. "I don't want to cause any trouble," she said, her voice carrying a hint of educated refinement that seemed at odds with her current circumstances. "No trouble at all," Richard assured her, already turning back toward the kitchen door. "Wait here a moment." Inside, he quickly packed a container with the day's unsold dishes, a portion of wild mushroom risotto, some freshly baked bread, and a slice of their signature chocolate torte. As he worked, his mind wandered to Catherine, remembering how she would always insist on preparing extra food, just in case someone in need came by. When he returned outside, the young woman had moved closer to the light. Something about her features tugged at his memory, the curve of her cheek, the way she held herself. She reached out to take the container, and as she did, her sleeve pulled back slightly, revealing a distinctive birthmark on her right hand, a small crescent-shaped mark that made Richard's heart skip a beat. He knew that mark. He'd seen it countless times over his 20-year marriage, had traced it with his finger as he held Catherine's hand. It was identical to his late wife's birthmark, down to the smallest detail. "Thank you," the young woman said, clutching the container. "I'm Emma, by the way." Richard barely heard her, his mind racing with possibilities. "I'm Richard," he managed to reply. "You're welcome to come back tomorrow if you'd like. We always have extra food at closing time." Emma nodded, offering a small smile that transformed her face, making the resemblance even more striking. As she turned to leave, Richard found himself rooted to the spot, watching her disappear into the darkness of the alley. Back inside the restaurant, he mechanically went through the motions of closing up, his mind preoccupied with what he'd seen. The birthmark could be a coincidence, surely. The resemblance might be his imagination, colored by grief and loneliness. And yet, in his office, he found himself opening the bottom drawer of his desk, pulling out the leather-bound photo album he kept there. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages, looking at photographs of Catherine in her youth. One, in particular, caught his eye. Catherine at university, her dark hair flowing free, her smile bright and carefree. The resemblance to Emma was undeniable. Richard sat back in his chair, his mind whirling with questions. Catherine had never mentioned having a child before they met, but there were parts of her past she'd been reluctant to discuss, especially her university years. She'd met Richard when she was 28, and they'd married a year later. What had happened in those years before? As he locked up the restaurant that night, Richard made a decision. He needed to know more about Emma. Not just because of the birthmark or the resemblance, but because something deep inside told him this wasn't just a coincidence. It was the same instinct that had led him to success in business, the same feeling that had told him Catherine was the one all those years ago. Walking to his car, he found himself looking down the dark alley where Emma had disappeared, wondering where she was now, and what secrets might connect her to his past. The autumn wind had picked up, sending leaves swirling around his feet, and carrying with it the promise of change in the air. The following morning, Richard arrived at his restaurant earlier than usual. He'd barely slept, his mind consumed with thoughts of Emma and the mysterious birthmark. The breakfast staff were surprised to see him. Normally, he focused on the dinner service, but he brushed off their questioning looks with a smile and retreated to his office. He spent the morning making phone calls, reaching out to old friends who might remember Catherine's university days. Most were dead ends, conversations filled with fond memories, but no real information. By lunchtime, he was beginning to question his own sanity. Was he seeing connections that weren't there, driven by grief and loneliness? It wasn't until mid-afternoon that he finally gathered the courage to call Charles Wellington, Catherine's father. Their relationship had been strained since Catherine's passing 5 years ago, both men dealing with their grief in different ways. The phone rang several times before Charles's familiar gruff voice answered. "Richard? This is unexpected." "Charles, I hope I'm not disturbing you," Richard began, suddenly uncertain how to broach the subject. I need to ask you something about Catherine's university years." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Charles spoke again, his voice had lost its gruffness, replaced by something that sounded almost like fear. "What about them? Did something happen during her first year? Something she might have kept secret?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard could hear Charles's heavy breathing, could almost see him sitting in his book-lined study, perhaps holding his ever-present pipe. "You've found her, haven't you?" Charles finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The girl." Richard's hand tightened on the phone. "What girl, Charles?" Another long pause. "Perhaps we should discuss this in person. Can you come to the house?" An hour later, Richard found himself sitting in Charles's study in his Georgian mansion on the outskirts of town. The room smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, just as it had when he'd first met Catherine's parents 21 years ago. Charles sat across from him, looking older and more vulnerable than Richard had ever seen him. "Catherine was 18, Charles began, his voice heavy with memory. She'd just started at Oxford. During the spring break of her first year, she went on a trip to Scotland with some friends." He paused, taking a long draw from his pipe. "She met someone there, a young man, another student. It was a brief romance, but—" Richard leaned forward in his chair. "She became pregnant?" Charles nodded slowly. "She was terrified, of course, didn't tell us until she couldn't hide it anymore. We weren't as supportive as we should have been." His voice cracked slightly. "She decided to give the baby up for adoption. Said it was for the best. She was too young, not ready. The adoption agency handled everything. It was all very discreet." Richard sat back, his mind racing. "Did she ever try to find the child?" "She looked into it years later," Charles replied. "But the records were sealed. She was told the child had been adopted by a good family, that's all." He set his pipe down carefully. "She wanted to tell you, Richard, many times. But she was afraid it would change how you saw her, afraid of opening old wounds." "I would have understood," Richard said softly, thinking of all the times Catherine had seemed distant, lost in thought. How many of those moments had been spent thinking about the child she'd given up? Charles stood up slowly, walking to his desk. From a drawer, he pulled out a small box. After we lost her, I found these in her things. I should have given them to you earlier, but—" He handed the box to Richard. Inside was a diary, its pages yellowed with age, and a small envelope containing a photograph. The picture showed a tiny baby wrapped in a hospital blanket. On the back, in Catherine's elegant handwriting, was a date and 2 words. "My daughter." "The diary," Charles said. "She kept it during that time. I've never read it. Couldn't bring myself to. But perhaps you should." Richard held the box carefully, as if it might crumble in his hands. "The girl I met," he said slowly. "Emma. She has Catherine's birthmark. The same one. On her right hand." Charles sank back into his chair. "Catherine had that mark from birth. The doctors said it was quite unusual. If this Emma has the same mark—" "She's the right age," Richard added, "and the resemblance is remarkable. What are you going to do?" Richard looked down at the box in his hands, thinking of Emma's face in the alley, of Catherine's smile in old photographs. "I need to know for sure," he said finally. "I need to read this diary, and then I need to find a way to talk to Emma. She deserves to know the truth, whatever it may be." As he drove home that evening, The box sitting on the passenger seat beside him, Richard felt as if his world had shifted on its axis. The possibility that Catherine had a daughter, that this daughter might be the young woman he'd met, was overwhelming. He thought about Emma's refined accent, at odds with her current circumstances, and wondered what path had led her from what should have been a privileged upbringing to living on the streets. The restaurant could wait. Tonight, he had a diary to read, and perhaps within its pages, he would find the answers to questions he'd never known to ask. Richard sat in his study late into the night, Catherine's diary open before him. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling, and her familiar handwriting filled each page with memories he'd never known existed. A glass of whiskey sat untouched beside him as he read, losing himself in his late wife's words from over 2 decades ago. March 15, 1999. Edinburgh is beautiful in the spring. The castle looks like something from a fairy tale, especially when the morning mist rolls in. I met someone today, James. He's studying literature at the university here. We talked for hours about poetry and dreams. There's something special about him, something that makes me feel alive in a way I've never felt before. The entries that followed told a story of a whirlwind romance, of young love burning bright and fast. Catherine's words painted pictures of stolen kisses in rose gardens, of long walks along the Royal Mile, of promises whispered under Scottish stars. But as Richard turned the pages, the tone began to change. April 30, 1999. The test was positive. I'm terrified. James is gone. Back to America for his semester abroad. I haven't told him. How can I? We both knew this was temporary, a spring break romance, but now everything is different. I keep touching my stomach, trying to imagine the life growing inside me. What am I going to do? Richard paused, reaching for the whiskey but not drinking it. He thought of Catherine as she'd been when he'd met her, confident and composed. It was hard to imagine her as this frightened young woman facing such an enormous decision alone. June 15, 1999. The adoption agency says they have a wonderful family in mind. Professional couple, unable to have children of their own. They can give my baby everything I can't right now. Mother and father keep saying it's for the best, that I'm too young, that I have my whole life ahead of me. But how can I explain that it already feels like my whole life is this baby? I find myself talking to her, I'm sure it's a girl, telling her I'm sorry, that I love her, that I hope someday she'll understand. The entries grew shorter after that, more painful to read. Catherine described the pregnancy, her decision to take a year off from university, the quiet arrangements made to keep everything private. Richard's heart ached for her, for the young woman carrying such a burden alone. September 28, 1999. She's beautiful, perfect. 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and the same little crescent mark on her right hand that I have. The nurses say it's unusual for birthmarks to be inherited so precisely, but there it is, like a tiny moon on her perfect little hand. I only held her for an hour, but I memorized every detail of her face. I hope she'll be happy. I hope someday she'll forgive me. I've left her a letter with the adoption agency, to be given to her when she's 18 if she wants it. I've tried to explain everything, to tell her how much I loved her, how letting her go was the hardest thing I've ever done. Richard's hand trembled as he turned to the final entries from that period. The pain in Catherine's words was raw, immediate, even after all these years. October 15th, 1999. The house feels so empty. Mother wants me to return to university next term, to get back to normal. But what is normal now? How do I go back to being just a student when part of my heart is out there somewhere with my daughter? I dream about her every night. I wonder if she's happy, if she's loved. The adoption agency says her new family named her Emma. Richard sat back in his chair, stunned. Emma. The same name as the young woman he'd met. It couldn't be coincidence. The birthmark, the resemblance, and now the name. But what had happened? The adoption agency had promised a good family, a better life. How had Catherine's daughter ended up on the streets? He continued reading, finding scattered references throughout the years to Catherine's attempts to locate her daughter. The most recent entry was from just months before Catherine's passing. April 3, 2019. Another dead end with the adoption agency. They say the records are sealed, that Emma's adoptive parents requested complete privacy. I respect that, but I wish I wish I could just know that she's okay, that she's happy. Richard would understand if I told him. I know he would. But after keeping this secret for so long, I don't know how to begin. Sometimes I see young women on the street, and I wonder if any of them could be her. Do they have my smile, my birthmark? Does she ever wonder about me the way I wonder about her? Richard closed the diary gently, his mind whirling with emotions. Catherine had carried this secret their entire marriage, this mixture of love and loss and hope. And now, by some incredible twist of fate, her daughter had appeared at his restaurant door. He pulled out his phone, checking the time, just past midnight. He couldn't sleep, not with all this knowledge churning in his mind. Instead, he opened his laptop and began to research adoption records, private investigators, anything that might help him understand what had happened to Emma between her adoption and now. The night grew older as Richard worked, driven by a new purpose. He would find out the truth, would understand how Catherine's daughter had gone from a promising future to struggling on the streets. And somehow he would find a way to tell Emma about her mother, about the love that had never faded, about the letter waiting for her somewhere in an adoption agency's files. Outside, the autumn wind continued to blow, carrying with it the promise of change, of secrets revealed, of broken circles perhaps finally becoming whole. The next few days fell into a pattern. Emma would appear at the restaurant's back door each evening, and Richard would have food waiting. Their conversations grew longer, more comfortable, though he struggled to contain the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him each time he saw Catherine's features reflected in Emma's face. He learned that she was indeed 24, that she had a degree in English literature from Leeds University, and that a series of unfortunate events had led to her current situation. Her adoptive parents had both fallen ill during her final year at university, depleting their savings on medical treatments. After graduating, she'd spent everything she had trying to help them, eventually losing their house and finding herself alone in a world that seemed increasingly hostile. "But you're educated," Richard said one evening as they sat on the steps behind the restaurant. He'd begun setting up a small table there, making their evening meetings more comfortable. "Surely there are opportunities." Emma smiled sadly, adjusting her worn beanie. "It's not that simple. Without a permanent address, most employers won't look twice. And then there's—" she gestured vaguely at her shabby clothes. "Well, appearance matters more than qualifications sometimes." Richard nodded, thinking of the smart business clothes hanging in his closet at home, of Catherine's old wardrobe that he'd never been able to part with. "What would you do?" he asked carefully. "If you could do anything?" Her eyes lit up, reminding him so much of Catherine that his heart ached. "I love cooking, actually. I used to help my mum, my adoptive mum, in the kitchen all the time. She taught me everything she knew about food. Sometimes I think I could be a chef, but—" She shrugged, letting the sentence trail off. Richard watched her, seeing the same passion for food that had driven Catherine to help him start his first restaurant. The coincidences were piling up, becoming impossible to ignore. He knew he needed to tell her the truth, but the moment had to be right. "Emma," he said slowly, "would you be interested in a job? Here, in the kitchen?" She looked at him sharply, surprise and suspicion warring on her face. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." "I know enough," he said gently. "I know you're intelligent, educated, and interested in food. The rest we can figure out together." He paused, gathering his courage. "Actually, there's something I need to tell you. Something about your birth mother." Emma's face went perfectly still. "What about her?" "I knew her," Richard said softly. "In fact, I was married to her." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the usual sounds of the city seemed to fade away as Emma stared at him, her face draining of color. Her hand, the one with the birthmark, clutched the edge of the table. "That's not possible," she whispered finally. "The adoption was sealed. No one was supposed to know." "I only found out recently," Richard explained, his voice gentle. "When I saw your birthmark, it's identical to hers. And then there's the resemblance. I spoke to your grandfather, Charles Wellington. He confirmed everything." Emma stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the concrete. "This is too much," she said, backing away. "I can't. I need to think." "Wait," Richard called, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out Catherine's diary. "She wrote about you. Would you like to read it? To know how much she loved you?" Emma stopped, her eyes fixed on the diary. For a moment, Richard thought she might run. Then, slowly, she stepped forward and took the book from his hands. "I need time," she said quietly, "to process this." "Of course," Richard nodded. "The job offer stands whenever you're ready. And Emma, she never stopped thinking about you, never stopped loving you." Emma clutched the diary to her chest, tears gathering in her eyes. Without another word, she turned and walked away into the gathering dusk. Richard watched her go, remembering how Catherine used to do the same thing when emotions overwhelmed her. Retreat to process things in her own time, in her own way. Inside the restaurant, Richard's staff were busy with the dinner service, unaware of the life-changing conversation that had just taken place outside. He walked through the kitchen, observing the controlled chaos of a busy evening, wondering if Emma would someday take her place among these dedicated food lovers, carrying on a passion that seemed to run in her blood. He retreated to his office, giving himself a moment to breathe, to process. He'd done it. He'd told her the truth. Now all he could do was wait, hope and trust that the same strength he'd always admired in Catherine would help their daughter find her way back when she was ready. A week passed without any sign of Emma. Richard found himself lingering at the back door each evening, hope fading a little more with each passing day. The diary remained with her, a piece of Catherine's heart that he hoped would help bridge the gap between them. The autumn weather had turned harsh, with cold rain beating against the restaurant windows. Richard threw himself into his work, but his staff noticed his distraction. Maria, his head chef of 15 years, finally confronted him in the kitchen. "Something's troubling you," she said, wiping her hands on her apron, "and it has something to do with that young woman who's been coming around." Richard smiled wearily. Nothing escaped Maria's notice. She had been Catherine's closest friend, and after Catherine's passing, she'd become Richard's most trusted confidant. "She's Catherine's daughter," he said quietly, watching Maria's eyes widen in surprise. "Catherine never mentioned—" "It was before we met. She gave the baby up for adoption." He explained everything: the birthmark, the diary, Emma's current situation. Maria listened intently, her experienced face softening with understanding. "Life has a way of bringing people together," she said finally. "Catherine would have wanted you to help her." "If she lets me," Richard replied, staring out at the rain. "I may have overwhelmed her with the truth." "Give her time," Maria advised. "Some gardens need gentle rain before they can bloom." As if in answer to his worries, Emma appeared that evening, just as the last customers were leaving. She stood in the doorway, rain dripping from her coat, Catherine's diary clutched protectively against her chest. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly. Richard led her to his office, noticing how she took in every detail of the restaurant as they walked through it. Once inside, he offered her a seat and a cup of tea, which she accepted gratefully. "I've read it 3 times, she said, placing the diary carefully on his desk. "Every word. She really loved me, didn't she?" "Yes," Richard answered simply. "She never stopped." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she wrapped them around the warm teacup. "My adoptive parents were wonderful people. They gave me everything they could. But I always wondered, especially after they fell ill. I had so many questions about where I came from." "Would you like to know more about her?" Richard asked gently. Emma nodded, and for the next hour, Richard shared stories about Catherine, her passion for cooking, her infectious laugh, her habit of humming while she worked. He showed Emma photos from their life together, watching as she traced her fingers over Catherine's face, noting the similarities between them. "She helped me start this restaurant," Richard explained, gesturing around them. "She believed in me when nobody else did. Her recipes are still on our menu. The wild mushroom risotto you had that first night, that was hers." "It was wonderful," Emma said softly. "When I was eating it, I felt at home somehow. Isn't that strange?" "Not strange at all," Richard smiled. Catherine always said food was memory made tangible. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the rain providing a gentle backdrop to their thoughts. Finally, Emma straightened in her chair, squaring her shoulders in a way that reminded Richard so much of Catherine, preparing to make an important decision. "That job offer," she said hesitantly. "Is it still available?" "Of course," Richard replied, trying to contain his joy. "We can start you whenever you're ready. I don't have proper clothes or a place to live or—" "We can help with all of that," Richard assured her. There's a small flat above the restaurant. Catherine and I lived there when we first opened. It's yours if you want it. As for clothes," he paused, unsure how to proceed. "Yes, I still have some of Catherine's things, from when she was younger, around your age. If you'd like." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled through them. "I'd like that very much." The next morning, Emma arrived early, wearing one of Catherine's old chef's coats that Richard had kept. It fit her perfectly. Maria took her under her wing immediately, starting her on basic prep work, but watching carefully as Emma demonstrated an almost intuitive understanding of the kitchen. During a quiet moment, Richard observed from the doorway as Emma chopped vegetables, her movements precise and confident. She had Catherine's touch, that natural grace in the kitchen that couldn't be taught. More than that, she seemed to come alive among the steam and sizzle and controlled chaos of a professional kitchen. "She's a natural," Maria whispered, appearing beside him, "just like her mother." Richard nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Watching Emma work, seeing her find her place in the kitchen Catherine had helped create, felt like witnessing a circle closing, a wound finally beginning to heal. That evening, as Emma was leaving for her new flat upstairs, she paused. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Not just for the job and the flat, but for helping me find her. Through your stories, through this place. It means more than I can say." Richard watched her climb the same stairs he and Catherine had climbed countless times, feeling a sense of rightness settle over him. The restaurant was coming alive again, filled with the energy of new beginnings and the echo of cherished memories. The next few weeks brought dramatic changes to both the restaurant and its newest employee. Emma proved to be a quick learner, absorbing everything Maria and the other chefs taught her, with an enthusiasm that energized the entire kitchen. Her natural talent with flavors and presentation became increasingly evident, and Richard often found himself stunned by how similar her culinary intuitions were to Catherine's. One quiet afternoon, as Emma experimented with a new dessert recipe, Richard brought out an old leather-bound recipe book from his office. The pages were worn with use, covered in Catherine's elegant handwriting, with notes and adjustments scribbled in the margins. "Are your mother's personal recipe collection," he explained, placing it carefully on the steel prep table. "She was always creating new dishes, improving old ones. Maybe you'd like to try some of them." Emma's hands trembled slightly as she opened the book, her eyes scanning the familiar yet unknown handwriting. "These notes, they're like having a conversation with her," she said softly, running her fingers over a page detailed with instructions for perfect pasta dough. "She was always very precise with her instructions," Richard smiled. "But she also believed in experimenting, in finding your own way with a recipe." That evening, after the regular dinner service, Emma asked if she could try making one of Catherine's signature desserts, a dark chocolate souffle with lavender cream. Richard stayed to watch, sitting at the prep table as she worked, noting how she moved through the kitchen with the same fluid grace as her mother. "Tell me more about her," Emma requested as she separated eggs with practiced ease. "What was she like in the kitchen?" Richard leaned back, memories washing over him. "She was magnificent, calm under pressure, but with this incredible creative energy. She could taste a dish once and know exactly what it needed, but more than that, she understood that cooking was about making people happy. She used to say that every plate that left her kitchen carried a little bit of love with it." Emma nodded, carefully folding the chocolate mixture. "My adoptive mum used to say something similar. She taught me that food was more than just sustenance. It was a way of showing care." As the soufflés baked, filling the kitchen with the rich aroma of chocolate, Emma and Richard continued to talk. She shared stories about her adoptive parents, their kindness, their struggle with illness, their determination to give her a good education despite their mounting medical bills. Richard listened, understanding better now the path that had led her to his door. When the timer chimed, Emma removed the perfectly risen soufflés from the oven. With steady hands, she topped each one with a dollop of lavender cream, just as Catherine's recipe instructed. The result was identical to how Catherine used to prepare it. Even the presentation matched her style. "It's perfect," Richard said after tasting it, emotion thick in his voice. "Exactly how she used to make it." Emma sat across from him, her own soufflé untouched. "Sometimes," she said hesitantly, "when I'm cooking I feel this connection, like I'm channeling something I never knew I had. Is that strange?" Not at all, Richard assured her. Catherine always believed that cooking was in the blood, a way of expressing something deeper than words. They ate in comfortable silence, the quiet kitchen around them holding memories old and new. Over the past weeks, Emma had brought a renewed energy to the restaurant. The staff had embraced her, recognizing in her not just Catherine's daughter, but a talented chef in her own right. "I've been thinking," Richard said finally, setting down his spoon. "How would you feel about creating your own dish for the menu? Something that combines Catherine's influence with your own style?" Emma's eyes lit up with the same spark of creativity he'd so often seen in Catherine's. "Really? You'd let me do that?" "More than that," Richard smiled. "I think it's time we started training you properly. If you're interested, I'd like to enroll you in culinary school. You could work here part-time while you study, learn everything properly. But the cost, consider it an investment in the future," Richard said gently. "In your future, and in Catherine's legacy." Emma was quiet for a long moment, looking around the kitchen that had become her sanctuary. "I've been reading her diary again," she said finally. "The later entries about her life with you, about this restaurant. She wrote about how food brings people together, creates families out of strangers." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I never expected to find my birth mother like this, through her recipes and her words. But somehow it feels right. She would be so proud of you," Richard said softly. "Not just of your cooking, but of your strength, your resilience." Emma smiled, and in that moment, she looked so much like Catherine that Richard's heart swelled with love and gratitude for this unexpected gift. This chance to help her daughter find her way in the world, to see Catherine's passion for food living on in a new generation. Together they began cleaning up the kitchen, falling into an easy rhythm that spoke of growing comfort and trust. Outside, the autumn night was drawing in, but inside, surrounded by the warmth of shared memories and new beginnings, both father and daughter by choice felt the first real stirrings of healing. 3 months into her new life, Emma stood at the pass of the Golden Forks kitchen, carefully plating her first original dish for the restaurant's menu. Her hands moved with confidence as she arranged each element: pan-seared scallops with butternut squash puree, crispy sage, and brown butter sauce. It was a dish that honored Catherine's love of classic flavors while incorporating Emma's own modern touches. Maria watched from nearby, a proud smile on her face. Over the past month, she'd become both mentor and friend to Emma, sharing not just cooking techniques, but stories about Catherine that helped Emma understand the woman who had given her life. "Time for the taste test," Maria announced, calling Richard over from his office. The restaurant was quiet, being between lunch and dinner service. The afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting a warm glow over the kitchen as Richard approached the pass. Emma held her breath as he took his first bite. "This is..." Richard paused, emotion flickering across his face. "This is exceptional, Emma. The balance of flavors, the technique, it's all perfect." "There's something else," Maria added, tasting the dish herself. "It reminds me of Catherine's cooking, but it's also entirely its own thing. It's like you've taken her foundation and built something new on it." Emma beamed with pride. Her first term at culinary school was going well, but this, creating a dish for her mother's restaurant, felt like a true milestone. "I found inspiration in her recipe book," she explained. "The way she combined flavors, how she always emphasized that each element should complement the others without overpowering them." Richard nodded, understanding in his eyes. "She would have loved this," he said softly. "Not just the dish, but seeing you here, creating your own path." Later that evening, as the dinner service began, Emma watched from the kitchen as the first orders for her dish came in. Each plate she prepared felt like a tribute to Catherine, a way of connecting with her across time through their shared love of food. Between orders, she caught glimpses of Richard moving through the dining room, speaking with customers, his natural charm and warmth making everyone feel welcome. He'd become more than just her mother's widower or her employer. He was becoming family in his own right. "Table 7 wants to compliment the chef on the scallop dish," one of the servers announced, breaking into Emma's thoughts. "They say it's the best thing they've eaten in months." Pride swelled in Emma's chest as she continued working, her movements sure and practiced. The tiny flat above the restaurant had become a true home, filled with not just Catherine's old clothes, but with new memories, new dreams. Her adoption papers and Catherine's diary sat side by side on her bedside table, both parts of her story now seamlessly intertwined. During a brief lull in service, Richard called her to his office. "I've been thinking," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "How would you feel about taking on more responsibility here? Learning the business side of things alongside your culinary training?" Emma's eyes widened. "Really? You'd trust me with that?" "Of course," Richard smiled. "This place, it was always meant to be a family business. Catherine and I built it together, dreaming of passing it on someday. I can't think of anyone better to learn its ins and outs than you." Emma felt tears prick at her corners of her eyes. "I never imagined," she said softly, "when I was standing in that alley 3 months ago that my life could change so completely." "Life has a way of bringing us where we need to be," Richard replied. "Catherine used to say that too." As they returned to the kitchen, Emma paused to look around at what had become her world. The gleaming stainless steel, the controlled chaos, the symphony of sounds and smells that spoke of creation and care. She thought of her adoptive parents, wishing they could see her now, knowing they would be proud of how she'd found her way. The evening continued, orders flowing steadily as Emma moved between stations, learning, creating, growing. Each dish that left her hands carried a piece of her heart, just as Catherine's had. Her mother's spirit seemed to fill the kitchen, not as a ghost, but as an inspiration, a guiding light showing her the way forward. As the last customers left and the cleaning began, Emma found herself standing at the back door where it had all begun. The autumn had given way to winter, and a light snow was falling, transforming the alley into something magical. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Richard asked, joining her. "I was just thinking about how everything has changed," Emma replied, "and yet somehow it feels like I've found where I was always meant to be." Richard nodded, understanding in his eyes. Sometimes the longest journeys lead us right back home. Together they watched the snow fall, both feeling the presence of the woman who had brought them together, whose love continued to shape their lives in unexpected and beautiful ways. Spring arrived in Cheltenham, bringing with it new beginnings and unexpected surprises. Emma stood in the restaurant's private dining room, surrounded by familiar faces and new ones, all gathered for a special occasion. It was her 25th birthday, but more than that, it was a celebration of family, both born and chosen. Charles Wellington, her grandfather, had become a regular presence in her life over the past months. Initially hesitant, their relationship had grown stronger as they shared stories of Catherine and discovered their common interests. Today, he watched with pride as Emma prepared to unveil something special. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, drawing everyone's attention. "As many of you know, today isn't just Emma's birthday. It's also the day we're launching our new spring menu, featuring several of her original creations." Emma stepped forward, her chef's whites crisp and professional, her confidence a far cry from the uncertain young woman who had once stood in the alley behind the restaurant. "Before we begin," she said, her voice clear and strong, "I want to share something with you all." She gestured to a wall where a photograph had been newly hung, Catherine in her chef's whites, laughing as she worked in the kitchen. Beside it was a new photograph of Emma in almost the same pose, the resemblance between mother and daughter striking. "This restaurant was built on love," Emma continued. "The love between Richard and my mother, Catherine, their love of food, and their desire to share that love with others. When I found my way here, I didn't just find a job or a home. I found my history, my future, and a family I never knew I had." Charles dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief as Maria squeezed his shoulder supportively. The kitchen staff, who had become Emma's second family, watched with proud smiles as she began to present the new menu items. "First," she said as servers brought out plates, "we have my interpretation of one of Catherine's classics, her wild mushroom risotto, but with a spring twist. I've incorporated fresh peas, mint, and preserved lemon while keeping the essence of her original recipe." The guests murmured appreciatively as they tasted the dish. Richard caught Emma's eye across the room, giving her an encouraging nod. He'd watched her work on these recipes for months, combining Catherine's techniques with her own innovative ideas. "Next," Emma continued, "I'm honored to present a dish that's very special to me. Using my mother's recipe book as inspiration, I've created something that I hope captures both her spirit and my journey here." The servers presented elegant plates featuring herb-crusted lamb with spring vegetables and a delicate sauce that showcased both classical training and modern creativity. It was a dish that told a story of tradition and innovation, of loss and discovery, of a legacy preserved and renewed. As the evening progressed, Emma moved among the guests, discussing her inspirations and techniques. She'd grown into her role naturally, displaying the same ease with people that Catherine had been known for. The shy, uncertain young woman from the alley had blossomed into a confident chef with her own vision. Later, as the celebration wound down, Emma found herself in the kitchen with Richard and Charles, sharing a quiet moment away from the crowd. Catherine kept a journal of her dreams for this place, Richard said, pulling out a familiar leather-bound book. "I think it's time you had this." Emma took the book carefully, opening it to find pages filled with Catherine's handwriting, business plans, recipe ideas, and dreams for the future. On the final page, she found a note that made her breath catch. "To whoever carries on this dream, may you find the same joy in feeding people's bodies and souls that I have found. May you understand that a restaurant is more than just a business. It's a place where families are made, where love is shared through food, where memories are created one plate at a time. And may you always remember that the greatest ingredient in any dish is love." She wrote that just before... Charles paused, clearing his throat. "Well, she always believed this place would pass into the right hands someday." Emma looked around the kitchen, her kitchen now in many ways, feeling the rightness of it all. "I wish I could have known her," she said softly. "You do know her," Richard replied. "Through her recipes, through her words, through every meal you create here. She lives on in this place and now in you." The three of them stood together in the warm kitchen, bound by love and loss and discovery, by the mysterious ways that fate works to bring people together, and by the healing power of food to create new families from the ingredients of the past. Summer brought a new energy to the Golden Fork. Under Emma's influence, the restaurant had evolved while maintaining its cherished traditions. The garden behind the restaurant, once merely decorative, now flourished with herbs and vegetables that Emma had planted, inspired by entries in Catherine's journal about her dream of having a kitchen garden. One warm morning, Emma knelt among the herb beds, carefully harvesting basil and thyme for the day's service. The morning sun cast long shadows across the small space, and the air was filled with the fragrant promise of fresh ingredients. Richard found her there, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "You've transformed this space," he said, handing her a cup. "Catherine would have loved it. She always wanted to grow our own herbs." Emma stood, brushing soil from her knees. "I found her sketches for the garden layout in her journal. She'd planned everything so carefully. Which herbs to plant, where they'd get the best sun." She smiled, looking around at the thriving plants. Had felt right to make her vision real. They sat at the small table that had been placed among the herbs, a quiet spot that had become their morning ritual space. These early conversations, before the busy day began, had helped build their relationship into something neither had expected, a genuine father-daughter bond that went beyond their connection through Catherine. "I've been thinking," Richard said, watching Emma sort her freshly harvested herbs. "The restaurant in Bath, the one we've been planning to renovate, I'd like you to take the lead on it." Emma's hands stilled. "The whole operation?" "You're ready," Richard assured her. "You've proven yourself here, both in the kitchen and with the business side. The Bath location needs someone with vision, someone who can honor its history while bringing fresh ideas." He paused, smiling. "Someone like you." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back, her expression determined. "I won't let you down. I know you won't. But it's not about that. It's about giving you room to grow, to create something of your own, while still being part of this family we've built." The word family hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Over the past year, their relationship had evolved naturally, built on shared grief, shared joy, and a deep, mutual respect. Richard had become more than just her mother's widower or her employer. He was the father figure she needed, offering guidance while giving her space to find her own path. Later that day, as Emma worked in the kitchen, she found herself thinking about the journey that had brought her here. The knowledge of her adoption had always been part of her life, but finding her birth mother's story, and through it, this new family, had filled a space in her heart she hadn't known was empty. Maria appeared beside her, watching as Emma expertly plated a dish. "You've got that look," she said knowingly. "The one Catherine used to get when she was planning something big." Emma laughed. "Richard's offered me the Bath restaurant, to run completely." Maria's face lit up. "Perfect. That place needs someone with your energy." She paused, her expression softening. "You know, watching you these past months, it's like seeing Catherine's spirit living on, but in your own unique way." The afternoon progressed, the kitchen humming with its usual controlled chaos. Emma moved between stations, checking dishes, offering guidance to the newer staff members, her confidence evident in every movement. She'd earned the respect of the entire team, not just because of her connection to Catherine, but through her own hard work and talent. During a quiet moment, Emma slipped up to her flat above the restaurant. The space had evolved from a simple refuge to a true home, filled with both Catherine's memories and Emma's new life. On her desk sat a framed photograph, one she'd found in Catherine's things, of her mother at university, young and full of dreams. Beside it stood a more recent photo of Emma and Richard in the kitchen, both laughing as they cooked together. The sound of the kitchen below drifted up through the floorboards, a comforting symphony of clinking plates and muffled voices. Emma changed into her chef's whites, running her fingers over the embroidered name on the breast pocket. Emma Wellington Blackwood. She'd taken both names recently, a decision that had felt as natural as breathing. Back in the kitchen, she found Richard discussing menu plans with the staff for an upcoming charity event. He caught her eye and smiled, the same proud expression she'd seen so often over the past year. In that moment, Emma felt the full circle of their journey, from strangers connected by loss to family bound by choice and love. As the evening service began, Emma stood at the pass calling out orders with confident authority. The kitchen moved like a well-oiled machine, each person playing their part in the nightly performance. Through the swing doors, she could see Richard moving through the dining room, greeting guests with his characteristic warmth. The restaurant was more than just a business now. It was the heart of their family, a place where Catherine's legacy lived on through both of them. As Emma sent out another perfectly plated dish, she felt her mother's presence not as a ghost or a memory, but as an inspiration guiding them forward into a future full of possibility. The renovation of the Bath restaurant became Emma's passion project. She threw herself into every detail, from redesigning the kitchen layout to selecting new decor that would honor the building's Georgian heritage while bringing in modern touches. Richard watched with pride as she navigated contractors, suppliers, and staff, hiring with growing confidence. On a crisp autumn morning, exactly 1 year after Emma had first appeared in the alley behind the Golden Fork, she stood in the empty dining room of the Bath restaurant, sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Richard joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Their morning ritual maintained even here. "It's really coming together," he said, looking around at the space that had been transformed under Emma's direction. The walls, newly painted in warm cream, provided a perfect backdrop for a collection of black and white photographs, among them several of Catherine in the early days of the Golden Fork. "I found something yesterday," Emma said, pulling out an old envelope from her jacket pocket, "when we were clearing out the old office upstairs." She handed it to Richard, who opened it carefully. Inside was a letter dated 20 years ago, in Catherine's handwriting. "Dear Richard, if you're reading this, it means we've finally expanded to Bath, just as we always dreamed. I can already imagine this beautiful old building filled with light and laughter, with the sounds and smells of wonderful food being created and shared. Remember what we always said, a restaurant is more than just a place to eat. It's a place where memories are made, where families gather, where love is shared through the simple act of breaking bread together. All my love, Catherine." Richard's hands trembled slightly as he read. "She wrote this when we first looked at this building," he said softly. "We wanted to buy it then, but the timing wasn't right." Emma touched one of the photographs on the wall, Catherine in her chef's whites, looking young and determined. And now here we are, making her dream come true. The next few hours were filled with activity. As deliveries arrived and staff began their training, Emma moved through the space with purpose, directing operations while sharing stories about Catherine with the new team members. She wanted them to understand that they weren't just joining a restaurant, they were becoming part of a legacy. In the kitchen, Emma had incorporated elements from the Golden Fork while adding her own touches. The herb garden she'd created in Cheltenham was replicated here on a larger scale, with planters on the roof providing fresh ingredients. Catherine's original recipes were given places of honor on the menu, alongside Emma's own creations. "Chef," one of the new sous chefs called out, "the equipment for the pastry station has arrived." Emma smiled at the title. It still felt new sometimes, but right. She'd earned it through hard work, through late nights studying and early mornings practicing, through countless hours perfecting techniques and developing her own style. As evening approached, Emma and Richard stood in the doorway, watching the sunset paint the honey-colored bathstone in shades of gold. The restaurant was nearly ready for its soft opening the following week. "I have something for you," Richard said, pulling a small box from his pocket. "I've been waiting for the right moment." Emma opened it to find a delicate gold locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of Catherine on one side, and on the other the words, "With love, always." "It was hers," Richard explained. "She wore it every day when we first opened the Golden Fork. I thought you should have it now." Emma's fingers trembled as she fastened the locket around her neck. "Thank you," she whispered, touching it gently. "For everything. For finding me. For giving me a home, for believing in me." "You did all the hard work," Richard smiled. "I just provided the opportunity. Catherine would be so proud of everything you've achieved." They walked through the restaurant one last time, checking details, making final adjustments. Tomorrow would bring the first trial run with friends and family, followed by the official opening next week. But for now, in the quiet of the evening, father and daughter by choice stood in the space they'd created together, feeling the presence of the woman who had brought them together. As they locked up for the night, Emma paused to look back at the restaurant's facade. The new sign gleamed in the streetlight, "The Golden Fork, Western 1999. Below it, in smaller letters, "A Wellington Blackwood Family Restaurant." "Ready to head home?" Richard asked. Emma nodded, feeling the weight of the locket against her chest, carrying her mother's love close to her heart. "Yes," she smiled. Home. The Bath restaurant's opening night exceeded all expectations. The dining room buzzed with energy as guests filled every table, drawn by the promise of both traditional favorites from the Golden Fork and Emma's innovative new dishes. In the kitchen, Emma moved with practiced grace, directing her team with the confident authority of a seasoned chef. Charles Wellington sat at the best table in the house, beaming with pride as he watched his granddaughter through the kitchen's open pass. Beside him, Maria dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, overcome by how far Emma had come from that uncertain young woman in the alley. "She's amazing," Charles said softly. "Just like Catherine, the same fire, the same passion." Richard, making his rounds through the dining room, paused at their table. "She's even better," he said with a proud smile. "She has Catherine's instincts, but she's found her own voice too." In the kitchen, Emma was putting the finishing touches on a special dish, a modern interpretation of Catherine's original wild mushroom risotto, the dish that had first connected her to her mother's legacy. As she worked, she touched the locket that never left her neck, drawing strength from the connection it represented. The evening progressed smoothly, each dish leaving the kitchen perfectly executed, each plate returning empty. Emma's new menu items received particular praise, her innovative combinations showing respect for traditional techniques while pushing boundaries in exciting ways. During a brief lull in service, Emma stepped out into the dining room, making her way to Charles's table. Her grandfather stood to embrace her, his eyes shining with emotion. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered, "so very proud." Emma squeezed his hand, remembering the journey that had brought them here. From the pain of losing her adoptive parents to finding her birth family, from homelessness to becoming a respected chef, every step had led to this moment. Later that night, after the last guests had left and the kitchen was spotless, Emma found herself alone in the dining room. The moonlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. She stood before the wall of photographs, her eyes drawn to the image of Catherine in her chef's whites. Richard found her there, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "Penny, for your thoughts." "I was just thinking about paths," Emma said, accepting a glass. "How sometimes the hardest roads lead us exactly where we need to be." She touched the photograph gently. "A year ago I was lost, alone, and now you're found," Richard completed softly. "We both are." They sat at one of the empty tables, the quiet of the restaurant wrapping around them like a comfortable blanket. Through the kitchen doors they could see Emma's team finishing the last of the cleanup, their easy camaraderie evident in their movements. "I've been thinking," Emma said, turning the champagne glass in her hands. "About the future, about expansion." Richard raised an eyebrow, encouraging her to continue. "There's a space available in Oxford," she said carefully, "near where Catherine studied. It would be perfect for a third restaurant, something smaller, more intimate, but still carrying our family tradition." Richard's heart swelled at her use of "our family tradition." "Tell me more," he encouraged. As Emma outlined her vision, her eyes sparkled with excitement. She'd clearly thought this through carefully, considering every aspect from menu concepts to staffing. Her business acumen had grown as impressively as her culinary skills. "The key," she explained, "is to keep what makes each restaurant special while allowing them to develop their own character. Like family members, connected but unique." Richard nodded, understanding completely. It was what he and Catherine had always dreamed of. Not just a successful business, but a legacy that would continue to grow and evolve. "When do you want to start?" he asked. Emma's face lit up. "Really? You think it's a good idea?" "I think it's perfect," Richard assured her. "And I think the timing is right. You've more than proven yourself here and in Cheltenham." They spent the next hour discussing possibilities, making plans, sharing dreams. Outside, the city of Bath slept, unaware of the new chapter being written within the walls of the restaurant. As they finally prepared to leave, Emma took one last look around the dining room. The space felt alive with possibility, with the echoes of laughter and conversation from the evening, with the promise of more memories to be made. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "sometimes I wonder if she somehow knew, if she guided me to that alley behind the Golden Fork that night." Richard wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Catherine always believed that love finds a way," he said softly. "That some connections are too strong to be broken, even by time or distance." Together they walked out into the quiet street, father and daughter by choice, their bonds strengthened by shared dreams and the legacy of a woman whose love had brought them together. Above them, the stars twinkled in the clear night sky, witnessing another step in their continuing journey. 2 years to the day since Emma first appeared in that alley, the Golden Fork family gathered for a special celebration. The private dining room in Cheltenham was filled with familiar faces, staff from all 3 restaurants, Charles, Maria, and the extended family that had grown around them. Emma stood at the head of the table, her chef's whites pristine, the golden locket catching the light as she raised her glass. 2 years ago," she began, her voice clear and confident, "I was lost. Today I stand here surrounded by family, some by blood, some by choice, all by love." The room was decorated with photographs chronicling their journey. Emma's first day in the kitchen, the opening of the Bath restaurant, the recent launch of the Oxford location. But pride of place went to a newly discovered photograph of Catherine at 18, holding a newborn Emma, her face full of love and longing. "We found that photo in an old box at Charles's house," Richard explained to one of the guests. It was the only picture Catherine had of them together. The evening was a celebration not just of their success, but of the bonds that had brought them together. The menu featured dishes from all 3 restaurants, classics from the Golden Fork, innovations from Bath, and new creations from Oxford. Each plate told part of their story. As the meals were served, Emma moved around the room, sharing memories and plans for the future. She'd grown into her role not just as a chef and business owner, but as the heart of their expanding family. Her presence in the kitchens, her influence on the menus, her care for their staff, all echoed Catherine's spirit while remaining uniquely her own. "I have an announcement," Emma said as dessert was being served. She waited until all eyes were on her before continuing. "We're starting a scholarship program at the culinary school. The Catherine Wellington Memorial Scholarship will provide full funding for aspiring chefs who need a second chance, who just need someone to believe in them." Richard beamed with pride, remembering their discussion about the scholarship. It had been Emma's idea, a way to honor Catherine's memory by helping others find their path, just as Emma had found hers. "And there's more," she continued, smiling at Richard. "We're publishing a cookbook, not just recipes but stories. Our family's journey told through food. From Catherine's original dishes to our latest creations, each recipe will come with its own story." The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause. Everyone in the room had been part of their story in some way, had witnessed the transformation of both the restaurants and the people within them. Later, as the evening drew to a close, Emma and Richard found themselves in the kitchen where it had all begun. The space held so many memories now, lessons learned, bonds formed, dreams realized. "I found something else in Catherine's papers," Richard said, pulling out an envelope. "I think she'd want you to have it now." Emma opened it carefully, finding a letter written in Catherine's familiar hand. "To my precious daughter, if you're reading this, then you've found your way home. I've dreamed of you every day since I had to let you go. Hope that someday you'd understand that my decision was made from love. Love for you, love for the life I wanted you to have. Know that you were always wanted, always loved. Know that wherever life takes you, a piece of my heart goes with you. And know that love has a way of bringing people together when they need it most. With all my love, your mother." Emma wiped tears from her eyes, carefully folding the letter. "She knew," she said softly. "Somehow she knew we'd find each other." Richard nodded, remembering Catherine's unwavering faith in the power of love to heal, to connect, to transform. "She believed that some things are meant to be," he said. "That family isn't just about blood, but about the choices we make, the love we share." They stood together in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the legacy they'd built together. Through the windows, they could see the herb garden Emma had planted, now flourishing under her care. The restaurant hummed with the lingering warmth of the evening's celebration, with the promise of more memories to be made. "Ready to go home?" Richard asked, just as he had so many times before. Emma smiled, touching the locket that carried her mother's photo. "I am home," she said simply. "Right here with our family," continuing the story she began. As they left the restaurant that night, the stars seemed to shine a little brighter, as if Catherine was watching over them, smiling at the beautiful way her love had brought them together, at the family that had grown from loss and found its way to joy. The Golden Fork stood quiet in the evening light, its windows dark, but its heart still beating with the rhythm of their shared dreams. It was more than just a restaurant now. It was a testament to the power of love to transform lives, to the way fate sometimes leads us down unexpected paths to find exactly where we belong. And in the end, that was Catherine's greatest legacy. Not just the restaurants or the recipes, but the love that had brought her daughter home and created a family bound by choice, by chance, and by the enduring power of a mother's love.